Assalamu alaikum, students. We're going to discuss a very interesting story today, but before we start off with the story, which is titled The Gift of the Magi, let me take you back on to what we have been discussing in this module so far. This is your Prose 2 paper, and it is titled ENG503. I know you're all in the third semester now, and you have studied a bit of literature, and you also know the different genres. So when we started this module, I outlined this subject for you, and I also pointed out that we're going to break this up into two sections. The first half is going to be concerned with the travelogue, and the second half with short stories. So we did the travelogue, we did Gulliver's Travels, the first voyage by Jonathan Swift, and you found out that Lemuel Gulliver takes a voyage to the land of Lilliput and finds very small people there, and his experiences in the land of the Lilliputians. And then we came on to short story writing, and I explained to you the fact that although the short story originated in England with Sir Walter Scott, there was not much work that was done in England in short story writing in the 19th century. And this form of literature was taken up on the continent in Europe. And writers like Turgenev and Flaubert were as forthcoming or as productive in this form of literature as the Russian writers like Chekhov. And in fact, Chekhov made such a name and place for himself in short story writing that to this day his style of short story writing is very popular, and a lot of the people who are working in this form of literature adopt the Chekhovian form of the short story. The other major category that was outlined was the event plot short story. And of course I told you about the other kinds of short stories also, but we concluded with the idea that these are the two main categories: the event plot story and the Chekhovian story. We have already discussed a number of short stories with you, and I explained to you that Edgar Allan Poe is one of the foremost short story writers. Although he is not an Englishman as such, he's an American, but his contribution to the genre of short story is undeniable. And with him you find out that each short story takes you into a new world. We discussed The Black Cat, and it took you into the field of magic and superstition and mystery. And then we did a descent into the maelstrom, and that was a totally different kind of story, where you have a few hours experience which transforms a man. It changes his life forever, and the experience is that he comes very close to death when he is with his brothers on a fishing expedition. And on this expedition he loses two of his brothers, but he's the sole survivor, and he survives in the form that is difficult to explain because his hair grows white, he gets lines on his face, and his entire body undergoes the kind of experience which is life-changing, literally as well as metaphorically. Physically, his body does not remain as strong as it was before he went on to this fishing expedition. And mentally, his nerves are shattered because he has experienced being in the maelstrom in the middle of a very big storm, and it's an experience that is physical as well as mental, because he loses his younger brother first, and then he loses his elder brother also, and he is the only one who emerges from that. So the descent into the maelstrom is a story which focuses on so many different aspects of life. Then we discussed the story that had the title of Eleonora, and that again is a love story with a difference. So in the stories that Poe presents, there is something which catches the attention of the reader and sustains it throughout the story. Now, we've just finished doing A Descent into the Maelstrom, which was the longest short story, and if you remember, we had to split it into 2 lectures. The one that I'm going to do today is not very long, but you need to know exactly what the writer is trying to say. It's titled The Gift of the Magi, and you need to know who or what the Magi are or were. So does anyone of you know who the Magi were? Well, let me tell you. You know the story of the birth of Christ. There are in different versions of the story of Christ's nativity, there are variations. One variation that's been given in the book of Matthew is that there were wise men who brought gifts for the Christ child because they saw a star being born in the heavens, and they traced that star, and they realized that it was directly above the manger where Christ was born. So these wise men or these kings, they brought presents, they brought gifts for the Christ child. And in the stories that are related, there are 3 wise men. There is a lot of discussion on whether there were 3 wise men or 3 kings, but there are sources that say that the wise men were synonymous for kings. In some pictures, you are shown 3 kings wearing crowns and the robes of a king, etc., etc., and they bring presents. Other versions say that because there were 3 gifts, the gift of gold, the gift of frankincense, and myrrh. So these 3 gifts were brought, and so this brings on the idea that there were 3 wise men and that each one of them brought one gift. Gold, you know, stands for worldly wealth. Frankincense is something that was used to perfume the oil, and myrrh, you know, again is perfume. So these three gifts were brought to the Christ child. Now, when we come to the title of this story, Poe has titled it The Gift of the Magi, and it remains to us to see whether he is using this title in earnest, in all seriousness, or he's being ironic. That is for the reader to judge. And I would like to guide you through this story so that you have the background of the gifts of the Magi, the three wise men who brought these presents for the Christ child, and see how Poe takes that story, which is more than 2,000 years old, and he brings it to the present day, and how he combines that concept of gifts for the Christ child with what is happening in society. Okay. So he starts off the story with this sentence, $1.87. That's the first sentence. That was all. That's the second sentence. The third sentence is, and 60 cents of it was in pennies, showing you that these 60 cents had been accumulated by collecting pennies. So $1.87. It's a very significant figure. A dollar, if you convert it into Pakistani rupees, is about 110 rupees per dollar. So if you convert $1.87, what you're going to get is something like 190 rupees, or maybe the maximum is 200 rupees. So 200 rupees is all the money, and out of that 60 cents is in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. So he starts off the story, he does not introduce the characters, but he starts off with the main issue. And the issue at hand is the total sum of money is $1.87. That is 187 cents. And the 60 pennies that are in the form of pennies have been saved 1 penny, 2 pennies at a time, scrounging from the butcher, saving at the grocer's, looking for bargains, trying to get the maximum while giving the minimum. The minimum in this case being the money, the maximum in this case being food. So he says that this money was gathered even though the butcher, the grocer, and the vegetable man or the greengrocer wondered why these pennies were so important. So 3 times Della counted it, $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. See the kind of language that Poe uses. Very crisp sentences. Sometimes sentences that you would say are not grammatically complete, but very short phrases, very short sentences that come like almost like the fire from a machine gun, staccato, 3 times Della counted it, $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. And it starts off by saying $1.87. So very short sentences, but very powerful sentences. And he says that Della the person who owns this $1.87, counts it 3 times, thinking that she may not have counted right the first time. Maybe she forgot a couple of pennies the second time. But even when she counts it 3 times, the total does not change. It's still $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. The entire concept of Christmas is one that needs to be understood. It's celebrated for the birth of Christ, and the day that is fixed in the Western Hemisphere in most of the countries in the world is 25th of December. Now, 25th December is supposed to be Christmas Day, and it's an occasion for happiness. It's an occasion for families getting together. It's an occasion for celebration. And on this day, gifts are exchanged between friends, between members of the family, etc., etc. So Della has only $1.87. There was clearly nothing left to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. Now you see how Poe uses language. He uses short sentences that have the maximum impact. So Della did it. So it was so frustrating for Della to have only $1.87, although she had spent months trying to save that money. She is totally frustrated, so she breaks down and she howls and she cries. And this instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. Life is full of tears. Some wept, the others unwept. Della is one person who weeps on the eve of Christmas, when it's a time for the whole world, as they say, for the whole Christian world, to rejoice, to celebrate. Della cannot be a part of that celebration because all she has in the world is $1.87, and she cannot buy anything that she likes with that money. So she cries, she weeps, and she snobs, and the writer says that life seems to be made up of frustrations like Della's. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. And so Poe moves from the figure of Della to her surroundings. And what does he see in his surroundings? A furnished flat at $8 per week, a very cheap flat. So you can understand that it will not be in the best of neighborhoods. It's probably somewhere in the slums, but it is home to both of them. It's $8 per week. You didn't spend much time trying to describe it, because it was a poor person's house. As he says, it had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. So the police force that arrests beggars, professional beggars, might almost have said that this is our kind of place. This is the kind of place where no respectable people live, where, let's say, you can put beggars and see if they can be reformed. So it was a poor person's house, there's no doubt about it. If it had not been a poor man's house, then she wouldn't have been crying because she had no money to buy a present. And then he gives a very strange description, and this description is of the outside of the house. And the description that he gives of the outside of the house is rather interesting. So I want you to listen to this and to see how he describes it. In the vestibule below this room, was a letter box into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. So they live in a house, in an apartment which has a letter box, but nobody writes to them. There is a doorbell that does not work. People who write letters are people who have relationships. Della does not have any relationships. And doorbells are fixed for people who want to come to your house. Nobody wants to come to this house because there is no money here. Money is the all-important factor, and everything else has to be subservient to money. So the description that he's giving is that of a home where poverty reigns supreme. So with this doorbell, there is a card that bears the name James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity where its possessor was being paid $30 per week. So this is a story of poverty. And he says that when James Dillingham Young was being paid $30 a week, those were the good times. Now you have the bad times. The same work is being done for $20 a week, and $20 a week are not enough to keep two people satisfied. These two people are James Dillingham Young and his wife Della. So he says that even the letters of Dillingham looked blurred. Now all these are signs of poverty. The fact that the doorbell never rings, the fact that nobody writes letters to them, the fact that the card bearing the name of James Dillingham Young seems to have the D left in the Dillingham, and all the other letters appear to have been erased in such a way that you think that because this man is not rich, he's going to contract his name, his middle name, to an initial, and that is D. Now that would be a very American way of dealing with things. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced as Della. So regardless of the fact that James Dillingham Young does not have any money, Poe says that whenever he comes home, he gets a big hug from his wife, and that's enough for him, because his wife loves him truly. So Della attends to her cheeks with the powder rag. So you know, when she cries, when she weeps, you have tears all over her face, and when she realizes that her husband is going to come back home, she quickly takes some powder, puts it on her face, and thinks that she is ready to face him. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a great grey cat walking a grey fence in a grey backyard. So all very depressing, none of it positive. So a grey cat, a grey fence, and a grey backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy him a present. And you know, you don't get anything for 200 rupees. You might get maybe toffees or chewing gums, But that's it. If you want to give somebody a present, you can't get that in 200 rupees. So she just thinks of what she's going to do, and she's nearly going mad with it. She says tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She'd been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. Expenses are always greater than what you calculate. It's a kind of place that you never reach, because the place moves farther away from you. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim, her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him. So Jim is her husband. She loves him very much, and she would like to give him something, something good to remember her by. So something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. So for Della, Jim is the whole world, and she is willing to offer everything to her husband just so that he will stay content, he will be happy, and he will not be frustrated. So Della wants to buy her husband a Christmas present. She has only $1.87, and she doesn't know what to do. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room, and even the looking glass in which she looks at herself is made of slivers of glass, thin pieces of mirror. A whole mirror would cost a lot of money, whereas thin pieces of mirror have been joined together, and in this Della can see her reflection before her husband comes home. So when she has been crying, she applies powder to her face, and then she looks at the mirror to see whether anyone can see that she's been crying or not. And suddenly, you know, she becomes very excited because an idea has occurred to her. She stands in front of the glass, and she lets her hair down. And what you see is a beautiful description that Poe gives here. We'll come back to this slide again. He says Della's hair was of the quality that if the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out of the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Now, I gave you one reference in the beginning about gifts, and I told you the story of the magi. Here you have another story which is given in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and which is also present in the Holy Quran. The story is that of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, the one you call Malka Saba. And the Queen of Sheba was a very rich woman. She was one of the richest monarchs, and King Solomon was the same. But the context in which Poe has used the story of the Queen of Sheba is that he says, with all her wealth, with all her riches, if she had been living in the present day and age, if she had been living close to where Della was, Della could just let her hair hang out, and the Queen of Sheba would be so jealous of her in spite of all the possessions that she had, that she would be totally frustrated. In the same way, he brings in the example of King Solomon. Now, King Solomon was the richest of all the prophets. And he was a king. He was a king in deed as well as in name. So Poe brings in the reference of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. And because King Solomon is supposed to have a lot of wealth, so Poe brings in his idea of wealth, and he says that there were two things that the Dillingham Youngs prided themselves on. One was Della's hair. You've already seen that. It's beautiful brown hair, and there are ripples in that hair, and it's like a cascade because it's so long and it's so thick. The other possession that they have is a gold watch. Now, that does not mean that this is a watch with a chain. Remember, we're talking about the 19th century. In those days, watches were worn in pockets, so that there was a chain that was going from the pocket to your belt or your garter, and anyone who wanted to take a look at the watch could take it out of the pocket and see it, but they could not go away with it. So it was very secure. It was not a wristwatch that is tied around your wrist. But so one was Della's hair. The other possession that they have is this gold watch that's been given to Jim by his father, and which had belonged to his grandfather before it was passed on to Jim. So they have these two possessions that no one else can compare with. And so when Della lets her hair loose, it falls about her, and it almost covers her. So long is it, so thick is it. And Poe says it reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. So once she's satisfied with letting her hair down, she picks up her hair and she ties it up very quickly and very nervously, because she's had an idea and she does not want to falter, otherwise she will lose courage. So she feels upset, but she's also excited by this idea, and she does up her hair again and she quickly leaves the house. So let's find out where she goes. She dresses up for the street because it's cold outside, and then she goes down the stairs to the street and stands in front of a board that read, Madame Safroni, hair goods of all kinds. So she goes and she stands before the shop. She runs up the stairs, and then she stops. On the landing, she stops, and she sees Madame, large, too white, chilly. She hardly looked French. French are not supposed to be hard. They're not supposed to be cold. This woman was. And Della has to muster up courage to throw this question at her, and she says, will you buy my hair? Now this is something that needs to be thought about. She says, will you buy my hair? And Madame Safroni says, I buy hair. Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it. Many people say that they have good hair, but not from the point of view of the person who's going to receive this gift of hair. So Madame Sofroni says, yes, I do buy hair, so take off your hat, let me have a look at the hair, and then I'll be able to tell you how much I can pay you for it. So Della takes off her hat, and her hair ripples down over her body, and Madame Sofroni picks up her hair, sort of weighs it, and says, $20 is what I'll give you. All her life, Della has been saving her hair. Now has come the time when she's ready to sell her hair. So she says, how much will you pay me for this hair? And Madame Sofroni says, $20. So Della says, give it to me quick. Now she could have bargained. She could have gone for a bigger sum. But she's in such a hurry, and it's such an outrageous thing for her to do, that she wants to take the money and spend it before she has time to think about what she's doing. So Madame Sofroni cuts her hair, takes it away, gives her the $20. And then what happens? Della goes out to the market. She spends 2 hours, and those 2 hours, it seemed, went like this. So fast did they pass, because she was searching for a present for her beloved husband, James Dillingham Young. So she spends 2 hours, and then she found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. So she makes a very thorough search. She doesn't leave any shop that she can later say she wasn't able to search. So she says that she spends a couple of hours turning shops inside out, and then she finds the ideal present. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. So what she goes and buys is a chain. Remember, Jim has this gold watch that has a very old leather strap. So the watch is beautiful, but the strap is ugly. So she sees and she buys this chain which is made of platinum, and which appears to have been made only for the watch. Now, Poe refers to Jim's watch as the watch because he's talking about this wonderful possession of Jim's, something that he's really proud of, and that he shows off whenever he has the opportunity. So when she sees this fob chain, she decides that this is what she's going to buy, and only Jim can possess this. This will go wonderfully well with the watch. So she goes ahead and buys it because quietness and value. That's the description that applies to both this watch chain and James Dillingham Young. $21 they took from her for it. So remember that $1.87 that she had? They took that dollar also, plus the $20 that she had received for her hair, and she comes back home with the 78 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. You know, it's something that he can now show off, because Della thinks that he doesn't take his watch out frequently enough, because he's a little embarrassed by this worn leather strap that holds his watch. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. Now, this kind of thing you can do in the heat of the moment. When you're excited, you're full of adventure, you go ahead and do it. The time for reflection, the time for thinking is later. So when she goes home with this present, she sits down and she thinks about what she has done. And then she got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. And this is where Poe's omniscient narrator comes in, and he says, you know, it's very difficult to think of reason, but reason does come in when generosity is added to love. So Della loves her husband, and she wants to give him a present that would be worthy of him, a present that he would keep, that he would remember her by. And so she takes out her curling irons, and she lights the gas stove, she heats the irons, and she starts to curl her hair. Within 40 minutes, her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She doesn't look like the Della with those beautiful long hair, but she looks what she has become at this moment, and that is a schoolboy with a lot of curls on his head, but without those long locks that she had. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully, and critically, and this is what she says: "If Jim doesn't kill me before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girls." You know, chorus girls were extras who were made up to attract at first glance, and who took part in films but who did not play any role. They were just there in the background. So he says, if Jim doesn't kill me, he'll say that I look like an extra because I have all those curls on my head instead of that beautiful long hair. But he says, what could I do? What could I have gotten with 87 cents? At 7 o'clock, and that's the time that Jim comes in very regularly. The coffee was made, the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. So that's what she's serving for dinner tonight, chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat in the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. So this day he was late and she had to wait for him. Otherwise he was never late. He was very punctual, very regular. But when she heard his step on the stair, she turned white for just a moment. It just strikes her, what have I done? What am I going to do? But by then it is too late. She had a habit of saying little silent prayers about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, please God, make him think I'm still pretty. So she sold her hair, but she's done it out of generosity. She's done it out of love for her husband. And when she hears the sound of his footsteps, when she realizes that he's going to come very soon, and she will have to face him with the truth, with the reality. She loses color, her face goes white, and she says a little silent prayer, and she says, please God, make him think I'm still pretty. So she's done this out of generosity, out of love. She still wants her husband to love her, to think that she's beautiful. So that's the silent prayer that she offers at this moment. The door opens and Jim steps in, and Jim has this fixed look in his eyes. He's not looking to the right, he's not looking to the left, he's not looking to the top, he's not looking at the floor, he's just looking straight at Della. And Della, because she's so guilty herself, she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't realize what Jim is going through. All that she can think of is that his overcoat is old, that his gloves are worn out, they need mending. She can only look at his appearance. But Jim steps inside the door, and his gaze, his look is fixed at Della's face. He's not looking at her hair, he's not looking anywhere else, he's just looking at her face. And it's like he cannot see what is on the side. It's like he has lost his peripheral vision, and he can just look straight ahead. So he looks at her with a very strange expression, and Della, because she's so guilty, she gets off the table and she goes to him and she says, Jim darling, don't look at me like that way. I had my hair cut off and sold it because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? So she goes on the attack mode. Instead of having to wait for Jim to say something, she attacks Jim and she says, you know, please don't look at me that way. I want you to love me. I want you to think I'm still pretty, but I had to sell my hair because there was no other way that I could buy you a Christmas present, and I had to buy you a Christmas present. And she says, you won't mind, will you? And then she wishes Jim Merry Christmas, and she says, let's be happy, let's not think about hair that has been lost, let's think about the here and now. So all along she's worried about what Jim will say. So she gives this explanation, and she says, you know, my hair will grow very fast, and I had to buy you a Christmas present. There was no other way I could do it, and all I had was a little money, so I have sold my hair. But you have to see what a nice gift I've got for you. And Jim says, you've cut off your hair? And it takes him time to absorb this information. It takes him time to believe what she has said. He is totally thunderstruck. You know, when he enters, he's so full of his own information, his own guilt, you can call it, that he looks at Della and he sees only her face. He doesn't see her hair. He doesn't see the rest of her body. All that he sees is her face, because he's so scared that the expression on her face is going to change when he reveals what he has done. So when she says, I've cut off my hair, that's when he realizes that he can't see the hair that she had in the morning. So he says, you've cut off your hair? And she says, cut it off and sold it. You know, she wants to be over and done with. So she says, don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I? So because she loves her husband so much and she wants to be loved in return, she says, I'm still the same. I may have lost my hair, I've sold it, I had it cut, but that doesn't change me. I'm still Della the person, the woman that you love, your wife. And Jim looks about the room curiously and he says, your hair is gone. You know, it takes him time to understand what she's trying to say. So Della says, you didn't look for it. It's not here. It's somewhere else. It's been sold. It's been given away. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. So then she says, you know, I spent the money for your present. And I don't want you to be angry because it's Christmas Eve. It's an occasion for joy, for celebration. And she says, hair will grow back. Hair is hair. But nobody can compare my love for you with anything else in the world. And Jim sort of comes out of a trance and he embraces Della, and Della finds out that while she has spent the money that she got for her hair to buy a platinum fob chain, Jim has sold his watch, mind you, his gold watch, to buy a present for Della. And what do you think the present is? The present is in this package that he gives to Della, and when she tears open that package, what she sees is a pair of combs, you know, the combs like you put in your hair, supposed to beautify your hair. And Della becomes hysterical. Della cannot control herself because these are the combs that she had longed for, that she had wanted to buy, but for which she had never had the money. And now Jim brings her the combs when she doesn't have the hair for it. The combs were meant to keep long hair in place. Short hair cannot hold combs. So it's when you do up your hair, you make a bun or you make a braid, that you stick the comb in, and the comb sort of holds the hair in place. It's like those clips that are used by women and by girls. So she knew they were expensive combs, and this is when she realizes that while she has sold her hair to buy a present for Jim, Jim has sold his gold watch to buy a present for Della, which she would be able to wear in her hair. And when she holds out her own present to him, he's totally thunderstruck, and he falls down on the couch and he smiles and he says, Della, let's put our Christmas presents away. They will stay. They're not going anywhere. But what we have for each other, the love that we feel for each other, is far more than anything, any material object that you could have bought for me or that I could have bought for you. The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. But, he says, the gifts that Della and Jim bought for each other, the love that they have for each other, the love that they show for each other. There are no gifts that the Magi can bring which would compare with the gifts that they have brought. Jim has a fob chain but no watch. Della has beautiful combs but not the hair to put the combs in. So each one has bought something which the other person needed but which was too expensive to buy otherwise. So they take this moment, this opportunity of Christmas to buy it for each other. So let us quickly go through what we have done today. This story is titled The Gift of the Magi, and the reference to the Magi is to that of the wise men or the kings who brought gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh to the Christ child when he was born. And the reference is to gifts that come without being asked for. The gifts that are brought by the wise men or by the kings and which have not been asked for, which have not been demanded. So when the story starts off, we are shown this woman in an apartment. Her name is Della. Her husband's name is James Dillingham Young. They are a very, very poor couple, and there are only two things that they own. One is Della's hair, which is long. It comes down to below her knees. It's beautiful, thick brown hair. And the other possession is this gold watch that Jim has, and which was given to him by his father, who got it from his father. So it's a family heirloom, and it has been passed on through generations. So these two possessions that they have, Della wants to buy a Christmas present for her husband. She doesn't have money. All she has is $1.87, and she realizes that she can't buy anything with it. So she decides to sell off her hair and buy something worthwhile for her husband Jim, because Jim is a wonderful person. She loves him very much, so she wants to express her love for him in the form of a Christmas present. So she goes to Madame Sofroni, who buys hair, and she makes wigs and hair pieces out of them. And Madame Sofroni takes a look at her hair, picks it up in her hands and says that she will give her $20 for it. So Della takes that money quickly, and she goes and she spends 2 hours looking for the perfect present for her husband. And at the end of 2 hours, she finds a platinum fob chain, which is a chain that you attach to a watch, so that you put the watch in your coat pocket and the chain attaches it to your belt or to a button of your coat. And it was supposed to be very stylish to wear a watch chain. So she buys that platinum fob chain. She comes home, she realizes what she's done, and so she starts to curl her hair, which she does very fast. She's practiced a lot. So because her hair is shorter now, much shorter than it was when she went out, so it doesn't take her long to curl her hair. And once she's done that, she sits and waits for her husband, who is supposed to come home at 7 o'clock. So 7 o'clock strikes, and she has to wait for a little while, because her husband is late that day. And when he comes in, he looks at Della, and he doesn't look at her hair, he doesn't look at anything else, until Della, feeling that the way that he's looking at her is probably an accusation. So she says, "Oh, Jim, please don't look at me like that. I've cut my hair, I've sold my hair, but it has been because I wanted to buy something for you. I wanted to give you a beautiful Christmas present. So please don't look at me like that." Now, Jim is looking at her with a very fixed gaze because of something that he has done, not because of something that he sees Della having done. He has something on his mind, and that is why he looks at Della in a very peculiar manner. And Della, because she's so guilty, she thinks that he's looking at her that way because she had her hair cut off. So she feels guilty and she tries to offer explanation, but Jim will not hear any explanation. And when she says, "You know, I have cut off my hair," she says, "You cut off your hair?" It's like he doesn't believe. And the irony is that both of them love each other to the exclusion of everything else. And they want to show their love for each other in a way that would be very difficult for any two people to show it. So while Della is feeling guilty because she sold off her hair, Jim is guilty because he sold off his gold watch. Now, that gold watch was a family heirloom. His father had given him because his father had given it to him, and so he passes it on to the son. So this family heirloom is a beautiful gold watch. But what Jim does is that he also thinks that he has no money to buy a beautiful present for Della. He knows that she has been looking at a set of combs. So he sells off his watch and he buys a set of combs for Della. And when he brings them home, Della looks at those combs and she doesn't know what to do, because combs are for very long hair. And with her hair cut off, Della has nothing to put the combs in. In the same way, Jim has sold his gold watch, whereas Della has bought him a watch chain. So Jim doesn't have the watch for the chain, and Della doesn't have the hair for the combs. So when Jim realizes what has happened, he just sits on the couch and he says, "Forget about the presents. The love that we have for each other is more than enough. We do not need to show it through these tokens, these gifts. The respect that I have for you, the honor in which I hold you and you hold me, is beyond anything else." And towards the end of the story, you have the omniscient narrator's comment where Edgar Allan Poe says that in spite of the fact that these presents show their love for each other, it's basically the love that they hold for each other which is important, not these gifts. So when you think of the story of Christ, it's not the actual presence. It doesn't matter whether it was 3 kings who came, or 5 kings, or 10 kings, or no kings. What matters is that they wanted to show their love for the Christ child. So whether they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, or something totally different, what is important is the love and the regard in which they hold the Christ child. That is important, not these materialistic things, not these outwardly shining objects. What is important is love and honor and integrity. That is all for today. Thank you for being very patient. Allah Hafiz.